begin our headlines on this Thursday afternoon, November 9th, here in South Korea. Foreign Minister Park Jin is sitting down with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken today to address regional security concerns as Pyongyang seeks to advance its military ambitions. And the Korean economy is expected to expand 2.2% in 2024 as exports regain tangible ground, but pundits believe fiscal prudence is essential in light of external risk factors. Meanwhile, Israel says it has no intention of reoccupying Gaza or controlling it for, quote, a long time, as the Biden administration calls for Palestinian residents to govern their region. Washington's top diplomat is here in Seoul for talks with its counterpart as Pyongyang seeks to ramp up its weapons ambitions. Our foreign affairs correspondent Ji starts us off.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived at the Osan Air Base in South Korea at about 9:30 p.m. on Wednesday, after taking part in a G7 foreign ministers meeting in Tokyo. This is Blinken's first visit to Seoul since President Yoon took office in May last year. The top U.S. diplomat is scheduled to meet with President Yoon before sitting down for a meeting with his South Korean counterpart Park Jin. Blinken's visit comes at a time of geopolitical instability amid the ongoing war in Ukraine and the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Before heading to South Korea and Japan, he told reporters regarding his trip that the U.S. is equally engaged in both vital work in the Indo-Pacific region and the crisis in Gaza. While he's in Seoul, measures to prevent further North Korean arms cooperation with Russia are expected to top the agenda, as well as ways to strengthen security and economic cooperation between Seoul and Washington. Ways to cooperate with China to deal with issues on the Korean Peninsula could also be discussed ahead of the highly anticipated summit between U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping in San Francisco next week. Blinken plans to head to India after wrapping up his trip to Seoul. Arirang News.
U.S. National Security Coordinator John Kirby says Washington remains prepared for contingencies on the Korean Peninsula. The remarks were made in response to questions by the media about the possibility of Washington becoming preoccupied with the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East to focus on its security commitment to the Indo-Pacific. Accordingly, Kirby highlighted the U.S.'s alliance with South Korea and their joint defense posture for broader regional stability. Palestinians in Northern Gaza are being forced to flee to the southern part of the region as Israel presses ahead with its ground mission against Hamas strongholds in Gaza City. Our Jae has the latest.
According to Israel's military spokesperson, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, during a televised briefing on Wednesday, Hamas has lost control of northern Gaza as thousands of Gazans have moved south. The spokesperson said some 50,000 Palestinians moved from the northern Gaza Strip to the south, adding that they're moving because they understand that Hamas has lost control in the north. While Hagari reiterated the government's stance that there will be no ceasefire, he said Israel has been allowing humanitarian pauses at specific times to allow Gazans to relocate south. In a press release also on Wednesday, the Israel Defense Forces claimed it had destroyed 130 Hamas tunnel shafts as it continues with its air and ground operations in Gaza. According to the statement, combat engineers fighting in Gaza are destroying Hamas's weapons and are locating, exposing, and detonating tunnel shafts. Meanwhile, the U.S. is closely discussing with Israel and Qatar a proposal for a pause in fighting in Gaza of up to 3 days, which will allow the delivery of more humanitarian aid and the possible release of some hostages held by Hamas. While Israel has made it clear that a humanitarian ceasefire would only come if the Palestinian militant group releases all 240 hostages, a senior Arab source familiar with the discussions said there was hope that a deal could still be reached, adding that the parties involved are at a critical stage of the negotiations. A diplomat briefed on the matter said that a pause of 1 to 3 days could allow the release of 10 to 15 hostages and also give Hamas time to gather information of the identities and locations of all the hostages in order to secure the release of dozens more. Jae, Arirang News.
And as Israel maintains its offensive against Hamas, concerns are mounting over the fate of Gaza after the fighting. The U.S., for its part, has reaffirmed its support of Gaza being run by Palestinian residents and not by the Palestinian militant group Hamas, nor by Israel. Our Choi Soo-young has details.
The U.S. State Secretary Antony Blinken on Wednesday local time said that Gaza cannot be occupied by Israel again. At a news conference after his G7 foreign ministers meeting in Tokyo, he also added that it's clear that authority over the governance of the Gaza Strip should be run by Palestine residents.
When it comes to post-conflict governance in Gaza, a few things are clear and necessary. One, Gaza cannot be continue to be run by Hamas. That simply invites a repetition of October 7th, and Gaza used as a place from which to launch terrorist attacks. It's also clear that Israel cannot occupy Gaza.
On Tuesday, Washington once again warned against Israel's reoccupation of Gaza following Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's comments that Israel will have indefinite overall security responsibility for the Gaza Strip. U.S. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby also said it's quite plausible for the Israeli military to remain in the Gaza Strip for a while after the war for follow-up measures, but the U.S. is firmly against a long-term reoccupation. On the same day, Reuters reported that Israel has no plans to reoccupy the Gaza Strip. An unnamed senior Israeli official stated that Israel has no intention of reoccupying or governing Gaza for an extended period. Furthermore, Israel emphasized that the ongoing operations in the Gaza Strip are effective and will continue, and they are not open-ended. Israel clarified that its military involvement is aimed at dismantling Hamas's terrorism and threats, but even after the military operations are complete, there will be a need for gradual measures against Hamas infrastructure. The Israeli government also said it's too early to talk about the next step scenarios for governance of the Gaza Strip, and their current operation is focusing on completely eradicating Hamas. Choi Soo-young, Arirang News.
It's National Firefighters Day here in Korea today. That is November 9th, which also represents the hotline number 119 that connects the public to the fire brigade and the ambulance service here in the country. Marking the occasion at Yongsan Children's Garden here in Seoul, President Yoon Suk-yeol applauded Korea's firefighters for their display of dedication and duty while responding to the deadly quake in Turkey earlier this year and wildfires in Canada this past summer. Here at home, firefighters were dispatched to 130 emergency sites and they rescued 110,000 people. President Yoon also called on his cabinet to speed up supplying the National Fire Agency with enhanced equipment. Some 1,000 firefighters, as well as delegates from the embassies of Turkey and Canada, were present at today's event. In other news, Korea's economy will expand 2.2% next year amid rebounding exports, but fiscal prudence is essential to ensure overall stability. Now, this is according to the Korea Development Institute. Our An Sung-jin covers its outlook.
The nation's economic think tank, the Korea Development Institute, has forecast South Korea's GDP to grow by 2.2% in 2024. That is a 0.8 percentage point increase from 2023's expected economic growth. The report released on Thursday noted that the expected increase in economic growth is largely attributed to a base effect caused by the low growth this year, as well as a recovery in exports. The KDI releases its annual economic outlook reports in May and November, though this year it published 2 additional forecasts in February and August to reflect the rapidly changing economic conditions. Forecasts for consumer inflation increased by 0.1 percentage point from August's forecast for both 2023 and 2024. November's report showed a rise in expected consumer inflation. It also showed a slowdown in domestic demand as high interest rates hit spending and infrastructure investment.
High interest rates tend to have a greater negative impact on goods consumption, and this is showing in the recent Korean economy. Despite this, the semiconductor industry, which accounts for a high proportion of Korea's exports, is recovering from the economic downturn, gradually pulling up the overall economic trend.
The think tank suggested that it will be necessary to tighten fiscal policies to ensure price stability, while emphasizing long-term financial stability and managing the impact of South Korea's aging society.
There is a need to promote structural reform throughout the economy to cater to rapid demographic changes and intensifying global market competition with technological advancements in countries such as China.
However, the report also warned of a potential delay in the economic recovery as global oil prices may surge amid the conflict between Israel and Hamas. It also noted that if China's real estate market plummets, hindering its financial stability, this may lead to decreased investment in Korea. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, quite a number of leading investment banks believe the U.S. Federal Reserve will refrain from interest rate hikes. Now, this is according to a survey by the Bank of Korea's New York office that polled 12 investment banks. 10 predicted the Fed's benchmark rate will stay steady between the 5.25 and the 5.5% range. The remaining 2 banks projected a hike to the 5.5 and 5.75% range. During their meeting last week, U.S. policymakers froze their key interest rate for a second straight session. Back on the local front, Korea is hosting its annual startup fair this week, and over half of this year's participants are foreign ventures. Our Lee Soo-jin was there.
South Korea is ready for its startups to make their mark. The country's biggest startup festival, COMEUP 2023, which will be held across 3 days, kicked off on Wednesday under the slogan, "We Move the World."
Now in its 5th year, COMEUP, hosted by the Ministry of SMEs and Startups, is focusing on helping startups expand into global markets and providing them with various business opportunities.
For the first time ever, most of the participating startups, 60% in fact, are from overseas. Continuing the global networking drive that began with President Yoon's state visit to the Middle East, global startups from 35 countries will be in attendance, including a 180-member delegation from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. To accommodate them all, there's a separate global zone set up, a new addition for this year. It stages company booths and country pavilions allow domestic startups to network and pitch to companies and officials from across the world. This year's COMEUP also features select local startups from various stages of development, giving them a platform to showcase their products. The festival also provides them with various opportunities for mentorship, networking, and investment. Arirang News sat down with the Minister of SMEs and Startups. She told us that this festival will highlight the strengths of South Korean startups.
South Korean startups are being recognized for their superior technology. For instance, in this year's CES, a quarter of the Innovation Award honorees were South Korean startups. In a digital era when new technology and businesses are needed, South Korean startups are already garnering much attention.
Also, this year's festival provides opportunities for startups to win what they need the most: capital.
At this year's COMEUP, there are 160 venture capitals from both Korea and abroad in attendance.
The minister added that she hopes that this festival will pave the way for more local startups to expand their business internationally, which will also help avoid business competition in the domestic market. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
Over at the Parliament, lawmakers across the aisle earlier endorsed a bill calling for tailored academic support for students with diverse cultural backgrounds. Our National Assembly correspondent Lee Si-hu reports.
15-year-old Sophia moved with her family from Kazakhstan to South Korea.
한국에 온 지 1년이 다 되어가지만 아직 한국 생활 많이 어려워요.
In less than a year, she learned enough Korean to enter a speaking contest hosted by the Migrant Youth Foundation's Rainbow Youth Center.
그러나 저는 지금 학생이니까 열심히 공부하고 학교에서 한국 친구들도 많이 사귀며 미래의 꿈도 이루고 싶어요.
Nationwide, there are over 168,000 kindergarten, elementary, or middle school students with migrant or multicultural backgrounds. This is over 3% of all students. For these students, South Korea is implementing new educational programs. By April next year, South Korea must come up with specific measures to support multicultural students' education. This comes as part of the revision to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act passed by the National Assembly in early October. The legislation requires local governments to create special educational programs for multicultural students and also provides a legal basis for related research by the Education Ministry. Lawmaker Kwon Eun-hee, a member of the Assembly's Education Committee, proposed the legislation.
If the existing multicultural education was based on the understanding of Korea and was conducted in one-way consideration, I think we should now move forward in the direction of mutual respect.
Kwon suggests a way of learning that can highlight students' strengths.
We urgently need to establish dual language education in our system of multicultural education.
Lawmaker Kim Chol-min, the president of the Assembly's Education Committee, also underlines the need to teach both the language and culture.
In these global times, multicultural students have the advantage of knowing the culture and language of Korea and also where they were born and where their parents are from.
And helping them is the duty of the Korean government.
For these students to grow into competitive talent in Korea in the future, I think we need to provide them with an education system that helps them to adapt to Korean society and also know their culture at the same time.
The Education Ministry is set on establishing foundational Korean language courses by region as well as offering special scholarships for multicultural talents. Lee Si-hoo, Arirang News.
A picture, people say, is worth 1,000 words. That being said, the work of video journalists to raise awareness about the ruthless reality of warfare was recently honoured. My colleague Song Yu-jin has this coverage.
These works have been recognized for their remarkable documentation of history from the front lines. They are the winners of this year's Hinzpeter Awards. Named after German video journalist Jürgen Hinzpeter, who filmed and reported South Korea's May 18th democratization movement, these awards celebrate video journalists dedicated to truth, human rights, and justice.
It often feels like we focus solely on the casualties and negotiations of the Russian-Ukraine war. This year's projects shed light on the voices opposing the war and have effectively portrayed the suffering of countless civilians impacted by the conflict.
The top prize, the World at a Crossroads Award, was given to the documentary Inside Russia, Putin's War at Home. It was made by a team of 4 video journalists who risked imprisonment as they covered domestic criticism of the Vladimir Putin regime, the opposition movements against the Ukraine war, and the demand for press freedom and free expression.
Sometimes your voice can be not heard, and it can be very lonely and isolating. But it's still worth it to stand by what you believe and stand for the democratic values.
The Battle of Bakhmut, the winner in the news category, shows what life is like in one of Ukraine's most dangerous battlegrounds. The 3 journalists capture the harsh realities of war through the lives of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians during their 2-week stay in the city.
When something is that dire, when the situation is that dangerous, I think that's when journalism comes in, and that's some of the times it's most important for us to be there to show the reality of what's happening.
The award for features went to Russian soft power in the CAR, where 2 journalists carried on the works of their colleagues who lost their lives while investigating the Wagner mercenary group in the Central African Republic 5 years ago. Just like Hinzpeter, these visual storytellers continue to illuminate the untold stories of our time, ensuring that the voiceless are heard and the world bears witness to their struggles. Song Yu-jin, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In the U.S. on Tuesday, voters headed to the polls to decide state initiatives and referendums during off-year elections. The night delivered some historic wins, including a pro-choice victory in Ohio. Ohio voters approved a constitutional amendment that will enshrine access to abortion in state law. In the nation's only race to include abortion on the ballot, it became the 7th state to guarantee abortion access, considered a considerable victory since the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade last year. And Ohio also became the 24th state in the U.S. to legalize marijuana for recreational use. The results, which also include Virginia's Democratic governor staying in office, as well as the Democrats taking full control of Kentucky State House, are good news for Democrats amid poor approval numbers for President Joe Biden. Malaysia's leader, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, told the parliament on Tuesday that Malaysians should unanimously back the Palestine cause, including maintaining ties with the militant group Hamas. On Tuesday's parliamentary session, the Prime Minister's reaffirmation of his support for Palestine came as a response to a proposal by the U.S. to sanction Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad's foreign supporters. He also urged media outlets to avoid describing Hamas fighters as militants, saying Hamas holds the same values as Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, which fought against apartheid in South Africa. Malaysia, a Muslim-majority nation, does not recognize Israel as a country and has maintained the position that no diplomatic relations will commence until a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine is secured. In Indonesia, former Communication and Information Technology Minister Johnny G. Plate has been sentenced to 15 years by the country's anti-graft court on Wednesday. The former cabinet minister was found guilty of corruption linked to the construction of mobile and internet transmission towers in rural parts of Indonesia. He was fined around $64,000 and ordered to reimburse the country for its losses to the tune of around $1 million. Prosecutors alleged that from a $533 million procurement project, the ex-minister pocketed around $1.2 million by turning a blind eye to feasibility studies on construction sites. Plate is the fifth former minister from President Joko Widodo's administration to have been sentenced for corruption. King Charles III, Britain's reigning monarch, got a taste of Korea as he visited Europe's largest Koreatown on Wednesday. In the first official visit by a member of the royal family, the visit follows a special mention of Korean President Yoon's state visit in the King's speech on Tuesday. Home to the largest population of Koreans in Europe, New Malden residents prepared a celebration of Korean food and culture, including traditional attire hanbok, as well as putting on performances for the King. 2023 marks 140 years of diplomatic relations between the two nations. Kim Seong, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. The early winter chill is taking a short break today before returning with colder air tomorrow. Then sub-zero morning temperatures await us this weekend. As much as we wish we could enjoy today's warm temperatures, perhaps the warmest we're going to have in a while, it's going to be rather cloudy with rain. Rain starts from central regions this afternoon, gradually spreading to the southern parts of the country and Jeju by tonight. Jeju could see up to 50 millimeters. The rest of the country could see 5 to 30 millimeters into Friday. Meanwhile, those in the southern provinces, especially in Gyeongsang-do provinces, could enjoy sunnier skies during the day. So please do so if you can, with highs going to the 20s this afternoon. Seoul tops out at 17 degrees, Daejeon at 20 degrees this afternoon. Looking ahead to next week, don't worry, we're not skipping right into the winter. Things will warm up by the middle of next week, but do take out your winter clothes from your wardrobe this weekend. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
Well, that brings us to the end of Thursday's afternoon newscast. We have our panel session coming up right after this break, so do stay with us. Thank you for now.
Contour the world, simply contour. India, the United Kingdom, New Zealand. Woo!
I'm excited. You excited?
Of course.
Yeah.
Music, start.
Welcome.
엄청난 에너지를 춤으로 뿜어내는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
한국에 오면 먹어야죠. 먹어도 먹어도 끝이 없는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
Seoul and Washington is seeking to ramp up their defense against Pyongyang's defiance. So what potential countermeasures do pundits believe will be addressed in response to North Korea's satellite ambitions? And what about the efforts to tackle Pyongyang's illicit weapons collaboration? Also, what are the broader implications of regional diplomacy amid global conflict and uncertainty? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we have a panel of pundits to address ongoing diplomatic efforts against North Korea's defiance and more. For this, I have Professor Choi Hyun-jin at Kyunghee University live on the line. Professor Choi, it's good to have you on.
Good afternoon, Sunny.
I also have Professor Pan Gil-chu at Korea University joining us virtually as well. Professor Pan, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Good afternoon. Pleased to join you.
Professor Choi, we have U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken here in Korea as we speak, and I believe Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is flying into the country next week, if I'm not mistaken. How are you assessing this latest flurry of diplomatic engagements between Seoul and Washington?
As you said, the U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken held talks with the Foreign Minister Park Jin at the Foreign Ministry building this afternoon. And he also visited the presidential office and met with National Security Chief Jo Tae-yong. So it is Blinken's first visit to South Korea since the Yoon administration took office in May last year. And in addition, the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is also scheduled to visit South Korea this weekend to attend the Korea-U.S. Security Consultative Meeting. So the ongoing Russian-Ukraine war and the Israeli-Hamas war have increased international instability. And tensions in North Korea are also rising, and due to Russia's military cooperation with North Korea. And in a dire situation like this, Secretary of State Blinken is expected to emphasize the need to strengthen cooperation between South Korea, United States, and also Japan to overcome this situation. He also looks forward to the role of the Yoon administration as well. And so right now, so many countries are concerned that the United States are focusing too much on the Middle East because of the war between Hamas and Israel. But through this visit, the Tony Blinken will send a clear signal that the United States is fully engaged with South Korea and also key allies in East Asia for the stability of the Indo-Pacific region. And secondly, the defense ministers of both countries are expected to focus on how to implement the extended nuclear deterrence together. The principle that was agreed by the leaders of both countries in Washington in April. And especially both ministers will discuss how to strengthen extended deterrence measures based on the deployment of 3 nuclear retaliation tools, that is ballistic missile, submarine, and strategic bombers. And lastly, there is a highly anticipated U.S.-China Summit next week, and therefore there is an opportunity for the U.S. and South Korea to coordinate and seek cooperation before this summit.
Right, indeed. Professor Pan, as Professor Choi just mentioned, Blinken's visit to South Korea comes just ahead of the planned U.S.-China Summit on the sidelines of APEC in San Francisco starting this weekend, I believe. That being said, what issues of mutual interest might South Korea and the U.S. address in advance?
Well, several issues might be on the list. First of all, these days, both South Korea and the United States have focused on the policy of de-risking, not the policy of decoupling, while defining China as a key target. That explains why the United States is eager for the U.S.-China Summit in San Francisco, and South Korea is enthusiastic about making the ROK-Japan-China Summit and the ROK USChina Summit feasible in the near future. In line with that, the APEC Summit could serve as a golden opportunity to make the policy of de-risking viable and functional for both South Korea and the United States. Moreover, the coordinated efforts for the policy of de-risking could contribute to mitigating the new corridor mechanism. So, South Korea and the United States are expected to discuss this issue in more detail. Second, related to the first issue, collective economic security or global economic resilience could be on the agenda. China has been recognized as a key perpetrator of economic coercion. So, the group of democracies has determined to introduce and adopt the concept of collective economic security. The problem is that the policy of de-risking might be confrontational with collective economic security. Accordingly, both South Korea and the United States need to address this dilemma in advance. Third, the North Korea-Russia arms deal should be dealt with in advance. As you are well aware, North Korea's financial transactions with Russia make international sanctions against North Korea unfunctional and neutralized. So both South Korea and the United States should push China to stick to sanctions against North Korea. How to do that is going to be a key issue for both countries. Finally, the Taiwan issue would be on the agenda as well in a situation where the crisis in the Taiwan Strait is growing. By taking advantage of the upcoming foreign events, particularly the APEC Summit, China is most likely to compel others to take its demand that Taiwan should be recognized as China's domestic affairs. So South Korea and the United States need to recheck the positions of each side once again on the Taiwan issue and remain harmonized.
Right, and talking about harmony, Professor Che, as mentioned by Professor Pan, intelligence authorities here in the country talk about a potential third spy satellite launch attempt by North Korea, and that this particular attempt might actually be successful. If that is the case, what joint countermeasure do you envision from South Korea and the U.S.?
Yes, I also predict that North Korea's third launch of the military spy satellite is imminent in the middle of close ties between North Korea and Russia. And in response to such military threat posed by North Korea, the Seoul and Washington have prepared some countermeasures. And one of them is the strengthening of extended deterrence measures against North Korea. And there's another measure. That is South Korean military is planning to launch its first independence reconnaissance satellite from the United States Air Force Base in California on November 30th, that is this month. If this launch is successful, this military satellite will provide our military with eyes on North Korea, greatly improving our so-called kill chain capabilities. The kill chain is a military operation to eliminate North Korea's nuclear weapon and ballistic missile before they are launched toward South Korea. So South Korea's military has, so far, South Korean military has relied heavily on the United States for satellite intelligence. However, once all of our satellite systems are completed, the South Korean military will be able to collect information on major facilities such as missile bases and nuclear test sites within North Korea every 2 hours through our own satellite. I think this is one of our own countermeasures against the launch of a North Korean satellite, spying satellite.
Right, and staying with countermeasures, Professor Pan, do you envision a counter response from South Korea and the U.S. with regard to North Korea's collaboration with Hamas on the weapons front?
Sure, it is really hard to deal with, but they should do something. As of right now, South Korea and the United States remain harmonized regarding the Israeli-Hamas war. The United States has announced support for Israel, although it recently has asked for a humanitarian pause in Gaza to Israel so that more aid is possible for ordinary citizens. South Korea seems to be in line with the United States' position while defining Hamas attacks as an act of terror. South Korea also plans to provide $2 million for humanitarian assistance. This harmonization could help both countries tackle North Korea's collaboration with Hamas. Meanwhile, how to tackle it is tricky. The joint statement to condemn their collaboration could be the first step. The second item that South Korea and the United States can cooperate with this issue is that they share information on North Korea's help with Hamas and find reliable evidence. These efforts allow tailored countermeasures to be applied as part of the effort to punish North Korea. The third item to tackle their collaboration would be that South Korea and the United States together examine the possibility that North Korea might adopt tactics carried out by Hamas in the sense that they are quite similar in many ways. Both North Korea and Hamas are enthusiastic about the military use of underground tunnels. They also applied mixed tactics that both conventional warfare and guerrilla warfare are made simultaneously. In addition, they are eager to neutralize the other's defense system, Israeli Iron Dome and the Korean tailored Iron Dome under development. With this insight in mind, North Korea is the most likely to carefully see what is happening on the front line in Gaza and most optimal way to apply those tactics to the Korean Peninsula. So South Korea and the United States need a coordinated effort to make the Korean Peninsula stable and peaceful, which includes strategic coordination and the development of military scenarios to offset those attempts. In this vein, joint response is not only expected, but required.
Right. And beyond the Korean Peninsula, but staying with the Israel-Hamas conflict, Professor Che, what do you believe are some of the challenges that the Biden administration may be facing in light of the fresh fighting in the Middle East?
Yes, it is. The Washington is facing a lot of challenges in the middle of this Israeli-Hamas war. This war has entered its second month. And according to the Palestinian Health Ministry, the death toll on the Palestinian side has exceeded 13,000 since the start of the war, with more than 4,000 of them children. And of course, we know that this number can be somewhat inflated, but it is true that there are a lot of civilian casualties now. But Israel has repeatedly rejected U.S. proposals for ceasefire, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made comments suggesting a reoccupation of Gaza Strip, defying American demands. So President Biden said that Israel's reoccupation of Gaza would be a huge mistake because this will lead to a long and costly war in the Gaza Strip with a lot of civilian casualties. But Netanyahu also rejected this proposal. And President Biden also proposed that on November 6th for a 3-day ceasefire for free hostages. So Biden's proposal was that Hamas release 10 to 15 Israeli hostages during the 3-day period and provide a list of all other hostages as well. But Netanyahu also rejected this proposal for humanitarian ceasefire from President Biden and also from Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who visited Israel on November 3rd. The United States continues to try to persuade Israel with a new phrase such as tactical ceasefire instead of humanitarian ceasefire. But Netanyahu has a strong reservation about a ceasefire, first because he does not trust, and secondly because an Israeli soldier was killed and kidnapped by Hamas during a ceasefire in 2014. So Netanyahu has this memory of Hamas cheating during ceasefire. And therefore, this is a very challenging situation for Washington. The United States has fully supported Israel since the beginning of the war. And Israel is considered as a loyal ally of the United States. So criticism of increasing civilian casualties in Gaza and Israel's refusal to ceasefire has become a political and also a diplomatic burden for the United States.
Right, I see. And against this backdrop, Professor Pan, of armed conflict in different corners of the globe and, of course, North Korea's support of Russia, do you see Blinken and officials here in the country perhaps discussing the possibility of weapons support for Ukraine?
I believe that the matter of continuous support for Ukraine is expected to serve as a key item for Secretary Blinken. This issue is particularly important because the Israeli-Hamas war has a tendency to distract the Russia-Ukraine war and weaken international cohesion of support for Ukraine, serving as a key event in the Eurasian geopolitics. To top it off, since Ukraine's counteroffensives turned out to be a failure, some in the United States as well as some European countries have begun to publicly express the need to stop or reduce support for Ukraine. From the viewpoint of the United States, if Ukraine loses war due to a lack of military assistance, it does not simply mean Russia's triumph in the war, but also the collapse of a rules-based order. If then the United States' status and prestige in the war is going to be plummeted. So the United States is in a situation where it encourages its allies and partners to remain cohesive in terms of military assistance for Ukraine. In this line of effort, South Korea's role is important because it is not only a militarily robust power, but also enough motives to bolster assistance for Ukraine. In terms of motivation, since North Korea has stepped Ukraine war by providing weapons to Russia, South Korea is in a situation where lethal weapons as well as non-lethal weapons might be considered to be provided to Ukraine in the foreseeable future. So obviously, Secretary Blinken is likely to raise this issue, particularly while indirectly asking Seoul to take a moment and review the option for including lethal weapons on the list of assistance for Ukraine.
Right. Meanwhile, back on regional security, Professor Che, later this month, top diplomats from Seoul, Tokyo and Beijing are poised to meet and discuss prospects of a trilateral summit within this year. Would a successful U.S.-China summit reflect favorably on prospects perhaps of a trilateral summit among South Korea, Japan and China?
Yes, the U.S.-China Summit is likely to be held in San Francisco on the 15th of November. And it would be the first face-to-face bilateral meeting between the two superpowers since their G20 summit in Indonesia last November. And this U.S.-China Summit is coming at a time of heightened tensions between the two countries, including over semiconductor export restrictions. And therefore, it is expected that both leaders will address some sensitive security and economic issues during this summit. And given the weight of the agenda and the political situation surrounding the United States and China, so many believe that it will be a difficult meeting. However, there is also potential for good things to come out of the meeting because Mr. Biden faces a presidential election next November, and also China is desperate for diplomatic results from the talks in the middle of a recent economic slowdown. And therefore, this suggests that both leaders of the United States and China need some diplomatic breakthrough and diplomatic achievements. And for example, and therefore, so if there are some positive results from this summit. For example, some agreements on the open and free global semiconductor supply chain, and also some agreements on the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. There will be really good news for South Korea as well. And these agreements and positive outcome from the U.S.-China Summit will provide some favorable environments for the success of South Korea, Japan, and China Summit. And for example, the normalization of a U.S.-China relation could reduce the risk for Korean and Japanese companies due to export control and semiconductors. And also, this will reduce political burdens on issues such as Taiwan Strait and also South China Sea. But however, as I said earlier, as the unstable international situation is prolonged and the two countries are fundamentally confronting each other as strategic competitors, it is difficult to improve ties immediately.
And speaking about ties, Professor Pan, in what direction should Korea seek to take its ties with China?
Well, to begin with, Seoul needs to share the key principle of bilateral relations with Beijing, which is reciprocity, while explaining what it means in detail. Based upon this key principle, South Korea and China need to discuss items related to law politics, including cooperation for climate change, coordinated humanitarian assistance, disaster relief operations, and cooperation for a stable free market. When the deadlocked relationship between the two countries made in the last few years take into consideration, South Korea and China might find it hard to tackle issues related to high politics, including military and security affairs. So basically, they need to revive their relationship while starting from easy ones and then evolving them into tricky ones. As part of the efforts to promote law politics agendas, they might start thinking about a platform for both MG generations to communicate culturally, academically, and even economically. In addition, track 2 conferences could be laid out to promote the discussion of experts between the two countries. A business forum could be designed to boost investment between companies in South Korea and China. In a nutshell, South Korea and China together need to dig out law politics agendas such as culture, education, business, and climate. Nuclear program needs to be touched upon because these nuclear provocations do not help the national interests of both South Korea and China. Although it is a high politics issue, South Korea needs to bring this issue to the table along with other law politics agendas.
Right, indeed. So address issues of mutual interest first before addressing issues of mutual concern. Professor Pan, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Professor Che, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Most welcome. On that note, we end Thursday's edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow. That is Friday.